Need to moisturize. Got a lot of talking to do.
When KWAME Kilpatrick was sworn in as mayor of Detroit in 2002 at the age of 31, he was the youngest person to ever hold the office.
This is the fight of my life.
Federal government.
The culture of corruption is over.
Ready to unleash an explosive case years in the making.
Hi, it's Kendall here. If you're new around here, welcome. Not new around here, what is up, home skillet biscuit? So last year, New York City Mayor Eric Adams was indicted on corruption and bribery charges, the likes of which people were, I guess, surprised to see. And I found myself particularly interested in the case. One, because one of my close friends actually decimated him on The Breakfast Club. I bet he sees Yemi in his nightmares. But also because it ignited a nostalgic hatred in me. It reminded me, perhaps traumatically, about the mayor I grew up with in a good old city named Detroit, Michigan. As a native Detroiter who came of age in the mid-2000s, one of the first moments of me having explicit political awareness was when I had enough cognitive function to understand I hate KWAME Kilpatrick.
He was the new hope for the Motor City.
To rise up!
And then came scandal.
Do you owe him an apology?
After scandal,
I don't whore around on my wife.
after scandal.
Former Detroit Mayor KWAME M. Kilpatrick was once a promising, I'm getting mad already, I barely started. He was once seen as something very progressive and promising, not particularly because of his policies, but because of what he represented. He was young. He was in touch with the youth, seemed to have a desire to push the city into the future. It was a divergence away from politics as the same old, same old. But the problem is, what we would find is that sometimes the divergence from the same old is a new worse. But again, he was a very promising young man, 31 when he became mayor. And if I'm not mistaken, he is still the youngest mayor to ever be elected to the office. In many ways, he was talked about in the same context as eventually would become President Barack Obama. And a lot of the same conversations in the DNC, KWAME would be kind of, in a way, a similar tier as Barack Obama. So that's to like put into perspective how much potential people saw in him, only for him to become an absolutely bumbling, pandering buffoon who just further disenfranchised already disenfranchised people from a struggling city. And so I don't want to mince words. I'm not going to confuse y'all. I'm not going to say, well, there's two sides. I hate this. I hate this. I don't want to mince no words. I don't want to confuse y'all. I am biased. I hate this. And I've hated him for 20 years. I've hated him for 2/3 of my life. But it seems like whenever I want to talk about him, much like any other like random rabbit hole I go down, people don't know what I'm talking about in my real life, or they do, but they were around when it happened, so they don't want to hear. I'm not going to talk my dad's ear off about it, you know what I mean? And the friends of mine who weren't as privy to Detroit politics at the time, or live out of state or out of country, they have no idea what the I'm talking about. And so today, I have decided to take it upon myself, the sacrifices I make, to sit here for God knows how long, talking about the rise and fall, the absolute confounding disappointment of a Mr. KWAME Kilpatrick. It's Avril, Kennie. And today's video is sponsored by HelloFresh, America's #1 meal kit delivery service that offers fresh, delicious, and healthy meals delivered straight to the comfort of your own home. Pre-portioned, pre-shopped for, pre-measured, sent to your doorstep so that you don't have to go to the grocery store because it stinks. It comes with easy to follow recipe cards if you're a newbie, but some of us live on the edge and have been doing this here cooking thing for a while. So you might want to innovate. I start putting stuff in the air fryer a while back. Great decision. It says you can get it on the table in under 30 minutes. If you got an air fryer, you can probably cut that in half too. Delicious, innovative meals if you're in recipe ruts, if you're just learning how to cook. It helps you get a little bit more confidence with some instruction along the way. And you know you'll never add too much or too little because it's pre-measured out. I've also been doing a cooking from home challenge because eating out costs a lot of money and it's not particularly healthy. And also I can get meals on the table probably quicker than it would be to wait for delivery. So it's been a great way to think less when it's a weekday meal in particular. And it's always delicious because that's the most important part. If you would like to try out HelloFresh, feel free to click on the link down below or scan the QR code around my noggin so that you can get up to 10 free meals and free shipping on your first box at HelloFresh.com when you use the code Kennie10FM. That's 10 free meals and free shipping for new customers only. Just go to HelloFresh.com and use code Kennie10FM. Big thanks again to HelloFresh for sponsoring today's video. Now let's get on to the debauchery. Part 1. Becoming mayor of the blackest city in America. 2001 was an election year, and after 2 terms, Mayor Dennis Archer would be leaving the mayoral post, meaning that it was up for grabs, baby. Archer was only the second black man to be mayor of the city. Prior to this was Mayor Coleman Young, who was mayor for 5 terms, only dropping out of the 6th race due to illness. Notably, Young was a very unabashedly black man, which made him very popular amongst the largely black community of the city. He was black as hell, black as shit. Everybody loved it. We like, hey, I love a motherfucker that's straight talking. He don't pander to these white folks. He just look in their face and say, you.
Young's involvement in labor earned him the unwanted attention of the government.
You've told us that you were the executive secretary of the National Negro Congress. That word is Negro. You said, I think you're mistaken. As a Negro, I resent the slurring of the name of my race.
It felt good. This is the 70s. A black man going up to a white person and say, you don't call me that, god damn it. Don't call me out my name. I am a Negro. Like, it was good. It was good shit. He was loud and unashamed. He talked like my uncles. But people loved Coleman Young, obviously. They loved him enough to vote for him 5 times. So he was mayor until he was old as shit and couldn't be mayor anymore. So undeniably due to that, Detroit would find, as well as other factors, economic factors throughout the 80s and into the 90s, more and more of the white population would move out of the city and towards the suburbs in a term called white flight, if you will. And the black population became more and more concentrated. By the time Archer would become mayor, the city was about 80% black. However, there was some sentiment that Archer wasn't representative necessarily of those constituents, leaving some to question if he was black enough to represent them. That his alliances were to coax back white people and businesses, but not necessarily to facilitate economic, political, social growth for the black people already within the city. Detroit having been a hotbed for racial tension, Detroit having been a hotbed for racial tension before and since the civil rights movement, it makes sense that this city has such a sensitive history with race and would feel a vigilance over the racial alliances that the mayor may have. And perhaps that protectiveness is what made some people really ask, what type of mayor should represent Detroit? Who will usher this majority black community into the new millennium? In comes a green, bright-eyed, young black man with a lot of charisma, 6'4", big, smiley, always had a smirk, a lot of gusto, named KWAME Kilpatrick. In the early 2000s, KWAME was a smooth-talking Michigan state representative that was at the tender age of 31, and he would become the youngest mayor in Detroit's history. And for a lot of people, this was a very glorious watershed moment. You know, believing that this man would bring hope and innovation to the office. There was a seduction in the endless possibilities of youth. But what they got was a smooth-talking boy who absolutely f***ed everybody over in ways that we did not see coming, did see coming. I don't even know. I hate this so much it makes me, oh! So a bit of a background about KWAME Kilpatrick. He comes from parents who both participated in public office. His father, who will become important later in this footnote in the trials. His father, Bernard Kilpatrick, served as head of the Wayne County Health and Human Services Department and as chief of staff of former Wayne County executive Howard M. McNamara. His mother, Carolyn Cheeks Kilpatrick, was a Michigan representative for various districts, and she would leave her chair for the U.S. House in 1997, leaving her Michigan chair open. KWAME would see this as an opportunity to get closer to his long-held goal of being mayor of Detroit. So he would run for her chair using the name Kilpatrick and its notability to springboard and quote unquote pass the torch. And this would work. He would win the chair in 1997. Now, KWAME's parents will be a bit of a fixture of his story because again, for better or worse, they are impacted and impactful in his story. And perhaps most superficially, one of the aspects that Bernard may have passed on to his son is his self-admitted propensity for infidelity. Bernard and Carolyn would divorce in 1981 for reasons completely unrelated to politics, according to Bernard.
Guys who think they're Romeo and trying to maintain a marriage at the same time. Those kind of problems, you know.
What do you mean by that?
No, I mean, I had like a couple of affairs. 5 or 6.
Kwame would perhaps inherit his father's love of the ladies, but also seemed to inherit his ability to seduce constituents. And this is where we're going to talk a bit about the church, the black church in particular. As a matter of fact, my first personal memory of Kwame Kilpatrick was actually him coming to my church that I was raised in. I'm not going to go into that, because that church is very, very weird. Now that I'm older, I'm like, that was really fucked up. Long story short, he was drilling for oil. Neither here nor there, but that was later, much later. Neither here nor there. I remember Kwame Kilpatrick and hearing stories of how he had come to the church that I was raised in to speak, and he had seduced the bishop into allowing him to speak. Ironically, my mother would later say that since then, the bishop had never allowed anybody else to speak because he was proven that wasn't a great idea. But the reason I bring this up is that it'd be remiss to ignore the ways in which Kwame particularly utilized not just the black community, but particularly the black community's connection to the black church and the black church's connection to the civil rights movement, the trauma of racial disparity, and he was able to manipulate all those things to make it seem like he was predestined even, to lead the city out of the bullshit that it was going into, lead us to the promised land. At this point in my life, I hate hearing this talk. I hate hearing him talk about anything, especially in relation to his religion and God, because he knows that Christians are raised to believe in forgiveness and that, you know, God uses the most unlikely people to persist and lead and yada, yada, yada. And they use all that bullshit to obfuscate the fact that he's a terrible person, and he's still a terrible person, and he will manipulate that idea and twist it for his own benefit. And one of the ways that he did that is told the story of how he decided to run for mayor, basically saying God wants him to run.
I pray and I say, God, listen, if you want me to run for mayor, just show me in the Bible. And I open it and put it on the floor, put my eyes down, and they fell right on 2 Samuel 5. And it was a story about David being 30 years old and the elders coming to him and asking him to be king. Say, listen, I just read the Bible. I'm supposed to run for mayor.
Had a very particular way of speaking that would have those echoes to the words of Martin Luther King and other monumental black civil rights leaders.
Let us be the generation that fulfills indeed our own destiny.
But he would speak to these people, especially at this time, older people in their like 40s in the early 2000s were babies in the early parts of the civil rights movement, or even a bit older, 20s in the civil rights movement. So they feel it. And so he would speak to them in ways that harken back to an MLK or other like prolific black leaders, particularly in a Christian-esque way. He presented himself as like a continuation of the progression that MLK started, or other civil rights leaders started, that he would send Detroit, again, already hurting economically and in a lot of ways, into a brighter tomorrow ordained by God himself. Literally makes me so mad and so sick. I'm not even playing. I would beat his ass if I saw him right now. like if I saw him right now, it would be on sight. And he decides to enlist the help of a longtime friend named Christine Beatty as his campaign manager. She would help him run for his mother's chair before, and she had no history of working for campaigns, as I understand it. But she would ultimately be a help to him to mobilize. Her job was to make him visible, to make sure that Kwame represented something clear and tangible and accessible. Former football player, he had a law degree, again, a very good speaker, old enough to harken back to the emotion of the civil rights movement, but young enough to relate to the hip hop generation. So he was able to represent the community of Detroit in a way that his opponent, Gil Hill, was not able to do so. But that doesn't mean he was a shoo-in. Actually, quite the opposite. Gil Hill was a cop turned actor turned politician who already had a name for himself in the community for playing the role of Inspector Todd in Beverly Hills Cop. You know that movie from the 80s, back when Eddie Murphy was young and skinny? Real cute, too. I see why he had like 58 kids now. But he was a local celebrity because of that, because people recognized him. And he was deciding to run for mayor as well. And at the time, he seemed like a shoo-in. He was well known and represented a comfortable status quo of Black respectability. He was a former police officer, particularly he was the chief of homicide before becoming a city councilman. So he appealed to those who wanted to over-police Detroit as a means to lessen crime in the city. He did seem in some ways the safest, most conventional bet for the mayoral office. But for those who weren't super keen on the over-policing of Black people, he kind of represented a continuing line of Black politicians becoming like police strongmen type beat. For instance, Coleman Young became mayor basically saying he was going to dismantle a very unethical board of the police that was targeting largely Black men. And that's how he was elected. That was one of the main reasons people elected him. But by the time he left office, he was very, pro strong fist of the law. And then Dennis Archer also continued some of those rhetoric. Whereas Kwame seemed to be a bit of a switch from the norm, superficially at least. He was young. He was cool. He wasn't a cop. He was for the community because he was of the community. He represented the community. So funny thing, not funny at all. The mayoral primary happened to fall on a very particular day in 2001. Fell on September 11th. So, not a large turnout. Much to the surprise of the people who, I guess, happened to see it in the midst of all the chaos. Kwame Kilpatrick was actually the winner of the primary, meaning that he would face Gil Hill at the actual election, which would take place in November of the same year. And again, we had the status quo, Gil Hill, and then we had the new possibilities, Kwame Kilpatrick, right? So in this moment of chaos, though, Gil Hill was very much so able to capitalize on how he was mature and tempered. He gave an air of stability to the uncertain city and country, I guess. And he would run using that largely.
Mayor Giuliani's performance during those horrific times illustrate how important it is to have a person on board who had had experience in deadly and trying times. And I think it's something that people in this community will have to think about when they go to the polls to choose who's going to be their next leader.
But Kwame was still pushing for the spot, campaigning at grocery stores, churches, bars. I'm not hating on that, but it will become a factor. Clubs. Also not hating on that, but it will become a factor.
No, he is dynamic. He came in the club. I said, what? He came in the club, man. They stopped the music and he talked for about 10 minutes. Had people hollering and screaming. Went left and went to another club.
And that strategy really resonated with the community. He was going out and meeting people, and he would use this strategy to galvanize his voter base. And surprisingly, he would actually end up winning the office in 2001, starting his term January 2002. He had finally done it. The years of wanting this office, the campaigning, the talking and the preaching and the galvanizing and the speaking and the Lord has ordained me to be mayor. He was finally mayor, and that did not want to be mayor. Up until this point, you may have seen a few podcast clips showing throughout the video. And these clips are from a podcast named Crime Town, whose second season is devoted to crime in Detroit. And about half of the season involves exclusive interviews with KWAME KILPATRICK. This is around like 2019, that we as people of Michigan and Detroit have not been privy to unless we had listened to this podcast. And I gotta say, very rich information in this bad boy, hence why I am using it very often. Again, about half of the season is devoted to Kwame, his time in office, and his subsequent fall from grace. And it's a gold mine that involved very detailed, intimate interviews with KWAME KILPATRICK while he was incarcerated. Spoiler. And in one of these clips, he outright says that he didn't want to be mayor.
The dog chasing the school bus and actually catching it. He chases it and barks and do it with such zealousness, but he really don't want to catch the school bus. You know, that's kind of how I felt that night. And I was like, oh my God, I actually want this job. I don't know how to be mayor.
Well, you should have stayed home then. The you do all this work to a over an entire city, go to jail, ruin his life, his marriage, his name, instead of introspect. Part 2. 2 truths, some lies, and a party at the Manoogian. Perhaps the thing that I hate most about this time, as we set up the KWAME KILPATRICK shenanigans of his early place in his term, is that it really illustrates that 2 things can be true at the same time. KWAME was a terrible mayor. He was a terrible person. He was and is a liar and a crook. But that didn't change the fact that the media was also quite racist. Now, that may confuse some people, being that, again, Detroit is like 48 million% black, especially at this time. It's less so these days. I don't feel like talking about gentrification today. But anyway, media outlets, newspapers, news outlets, the like, were mostly white. And so, by proxy, a lot of the people who did investigative journalism around KWAME were often white. And they had a lot of problems with KWAME, some of which was legitimate, obviously, as we get into this, but some of it was just giving racist. It was just giving racism, you know? One of the things that would be an early issue in his mayoralship were a few things. There were some aspects that KWAME just simply didn't fit into the quote-unquote respectable black politician aesthetic. He would be called the Detroit hip-hop mayor, a moniker that he would be given by black businessman and alleged sex offender Russell Simmons at a Detroit hip-hop summit where they brought Nas and Eminem and some other rappers. Is pretty innocuous. Like, this would be somewhat of a shadow over his head, and it wouldn't have been if he weren't black. And it would be brought up in interviews regularly as a means to undermine him, demean him, and undercut him as a reputable politician or mayor at this point. They also didn't like that he had an earring in his left ear, shine every time he said something, and they thought this was, reminiscent of that hip-hop lifestyle. Thug. Also, wearing earrings at this time was a lot more taboo for men, which is so funny, because who the cares? He couldn't just be a corrupt politician. He had to be the hip-hop mayor who represented thugs and violence and sex, drugs, and alcohol. But the problem is, he was also a very shitty mayor who didn't help us in that way either. And the thing that makes me so mad about KWAME KILPATRICK, among many things, is that he was the crook they thought he was, and that pisses me off. But he used the fact that, again, this city has a very complicated history with race, often used very racially charged criticism towards him to obfuscate the fact that he had very real things that he was doing that was concerning and worth criticism very early in his administration. Now, I've kind of touched on this a little bit, but when KWAME KILPATRICK officially becomes mayor, he admittedly walks into a bit of a economic clusterfuck. Again, over the years, a lot of businesses had been moving out of the city proper, going to suburbs. A lot of people were moving out to suburbs, largely white populations. There was an over-policing going on, and we were in economic decline. Being that he was so young and perceived as immature, a lot of people thought he wasn't ready for that undertaking. And unfortunately, that was true. He started with balancing the budget. That resulted in shaving off quite a few city positions. He took a I think 20% pay cut. So he says, again, we'll get to that. Doesn't really matter if you got a pay cut if you end up taking bribes. I think he closed zoos and aquariums and other like just public things that people went to. Around this time, a lot of schools were closing down as well. You know, we were just struggling and everyone could kind of feel it. There was a lot going on with the auto industry. It was just not a good time. But again, part of the reason why Kwame was chosen is because he was supposed to be a fresh look on things, switch things up. Obviously, the old way wasn't working, so let's try something new. So by the time he was already in the office, preaching to the citizens of Detroit that we're going to have to, we're going to have to scrimp and save a little bit. We're going to have to, this is a very lean budget and we're going to all have to make sacrifices. So it didn't look great. Some of the ways that Kwame had a need, a fixation even on flexing. That was a fancy and expensive dresser. Was constantly in designer, always looking like Al Capone / Steve Harvey. Again, we have the diamond earring shining in the light. If we're talking about it racially, up, but if we're talking about how do you have so much money as a public official, especially when the city is struggling so bad, to have a new suit on every day, a new designer suit on every day. You have 80 million bodyguards. He would walk around with like slews of bodyguards. He would drive in these really fancy cars. Like he was always wearing something new and cool. So people started saying, where are you getting the money to buy this stuff? Thus, investigative journalists started doing a little snooping. A little did the Kilpatrick administration know of a little thing called freedom of information. So some journalists will file a FOIA request to see the administration's bank expense reports, trying to figure out where is this money coming from. And it would be shown that in a pretty short amount of time, he had spent over $200,000 of taxpayer money that we do not have on spa visits, which we would later find out was for him and mistresses often, champagne, expensive dinners, and a nearly $25,000 lease for a brand new Lincoln Navigator for his wife. Conveniently, $24,995, $5 under the amount of which would need city council approval. Wonder why that is. Now, for reference, the previous mayor prior to him, Dennis Archer, would show that he didn't charge taxpayers for alcohol and would pay for any meal over $40 out of pocket. Again, this is particularly a smack in the face of people who are being told to scrimp and save because, we just got to make those sacrifices, and the money that are sending over in taxes you're using to take your bitch out to spa dates. Again, we don't know that he's cheating yet, but he was spending money on doodle shit, on stupid shit. Okay.
Reporters pressed Kilpatrick on his own excesses. He lost it.
Hey, don't. Who is Carmen?
And thus, when people got reasonably upset about it, him and his mama, again, a U.S. representative at this point, will do the first of many fist raises, weaponizing the fact that, again, people do be racist and saying that, no, he didn't do anything that's shady as Instead, he is the victim of a racist media, and he used that as the reason why he cannot be held accountable for the shit he did to those same Black people, weaponizing the fact that Black people fought so hard for positions like that, died for Kwame to have a chance to be a head mayor, and it just makes my blood boil with how manipulative it is.
He didn't just get up in here by just coming. Y'all sent him up in here. Don't let nobody talk about y'all's boy. Too many people died for us.
Coming out calling that y'all boy. He ain't my boy. Him. Now, Kwame was a partier, which didn't do much to quell those concerns about him being a bit too immature to be mayor. Honestly, I don't know if this is my own respectability coming out or just the trauma in relation to the story, but would you not find it strange to see your mayor at the titty bar on Saturday nights? It's a little weird. You shouldn't be that accessible. I shouldn't be able to touch you at the place that I get shit-faced. You know what I mean? It's a little weird. And I don't know if I'm just being old-fashioned again, but would I feel comfortable with the mayor being in the VIP section of Penthouse Strip Club on 8 Mile next to TJ's Coney Island? I don't know. It's too close,
Young Black people just call him Kwame, and I'm like, hold on. We respect the titles that people have. It is Mayor Kilpatrick in this class. So this young woman's thing is, well, Professor, you may say that, but let me tell you about the club down the street and who's in there at 2. And I'm like, oh my goodness. This was the culture of the administration.
It was already going around town that Kwame had a propensity to be a partier. So when a rumor started circulating that Kwame Kilpatrick had actually had a bachelor party with allegedly 50 plus strippers at the Manoogian mansion, which is the mansion that the mayor lives in, and that a stripper was assaulted by his wife Carlita upon discovering the dancer dancing on Kwame, it got a bit of traction. Now, of course, Kwame would adamantly, immediately deny having affairs on his wife, that he doesn't have wicked wild parties, and called the rumors about the parties absolutely ridiculous.
I want people to understand that I would never disrespect my God, my wife, or my children.
I don't whore around on my wife, and I don't have wicked nude parties at my house.
He would even do a press conference in front of the Manoogian where he would address the party rumors.
I want to stand here and tell the citizens of the city of Detroit that Kwame Kilpatrick has absolutely nothing to hide about any of these allegations. Come in, look at it, and then get out so we can get back to the progress and prosperity of the city of Detroit.
A man named Gary Brown, who we will talk about in a second, and the quote, demonic influences that must be stopped.
This demonic influence has to stop. The frenzy has to stop. After you asked all of the questions that you want, after you get all the information and look under all the rocks that you can find, can we get back to the citizens of the city of Detroit moving forward and rising up together?
Now, the myth around the Manoogian is a part of Detroit lore that to this day has not been completely proven, right? But I would argue that that actually doesn't matter whether or not the party happened. I believe it did, for record. But what does matter are the moving parts around investigating whether or not it did occur. And that is where the first bricks start to fall. Part 3, Gary Brown, Tamara Greene, and a second term. So let's talk about Gary Brown. Gary Brown was the head of internal affairs, meaning that he was the police person in charge of investigating the police. And Kwame Kilpatrick would, without really saying why, no real explanation, to this day we don't really get an explicit explanation why, he just fired him, claiming that he had done some shit. And this got a lot of people wondering, well, why did you just randomly fire a man who's been doing that job for, at that point, about 20 years? He was like, what is going on? What happened? It would seem, prior to his termination, that Gary Brown was investigating a number of things, but most noticeably, the rumored party at the Manoogian mansion. He had been informed of the party by Kwame Kilpatrick's former bodyguard, Harold Neilthorpe. Got it. And upon beginning his investigation, he was fired. Again, Kwame would give vague reasons as to why this happened, saying that he didn't follow chain of command or something, but never gave an explicit, what are you talking about? And Gary Brown was like, this feels like retaliation. It feels like you're full of shit because he's full of shit.
Really didn't hear anything of substance. He certainly didn't indicate why he fired me. At least I didn't hear it. And I think I didn't hear it because he doesn't really have a plausible explanation.
Let's take a little segue over to another person of import who will be referenced a lot throughout the unraveling of the Kwame Kilpatrick empire, if you will. And that is a woman by the name of Tamara Greene. Tamara Greene was a popular exotic dancer in the early 2000s, known largely by her stage name, which was Strawberry. And she would dance for many powerful people in politics, musicians, people in the streets. And Tamara Greene was the woman who was allegedly assaulted by Kwame Kilpatrick's wife, Carlita, at that rumored, fabled Manoogian mansion party. About 6 months after the alleged party, she would pick up her boyfriend, a prolific drug dealer, after her shift at a strip club, and that night she would be killed in a drive-by shooting. Unfortunately, Tamara's killers have to this day never been found. Actually, I was reminded of this part of the Kwame Kilpatrick story because her daughter actually talked about the fact that her murder was quite possibly a cover-up. Actually, if I can find that TikTok, I'll put that.
My mom was a very popular stripper in the early 2000s, and as you can imagine, that industry, you meet a lot of powerful, rich, famous people. My mom ended up having an affair with the mayor of the city, who was married at the time. Things got messy, and The mayor of Detroit's wife actually assaulted my mother.
Over the years, it's just been said basically that Tamara was an unfortunate bystander in a drug-related drive-by, and that was it. She was unfortunately killed as an innocent bystander in a drug dispute. And I'm not going to say that's not possible. That's very possible. But it does seem that for some reason, a lot of people seem to be very invested in not finding out who killed Tamara Greene. So there was a lot of questions that would come to light regarding Tamara's death, particularly because a cop on the scene say or note that the bullets found at the scene were the same caliber bullet and the same type of bullet that were issued to Detroit police. So we hear that. We have Gary Brown getting fired for investigating it. A former bodyguard of Kwame Kilpatrick talking about the party. Something's not looking great here. And so people start asking some questions. Did Kwame Kilpatrick conspire with corrupt Detroit police to put a hit out on Tamara Greene, to keep the Manoogian mansion story a mystery? Kwame Kilpatrick swears he had nothing to do with it, but he swears that he didn't do a lot of shit. So I know.
Instead of paying my mother hush money, the mayor decided to pay off cops in the city to murder my mother. She was murdered in a drive-by with police-issued guns. I worked in the industry myself, so I've met people who knew my mother, seen her around the mayor, and they do not want any parts of my mother's case. So to this day, it's an unsolved murder. But after so many years of trying to fight for justice, I have been a standing lone wolf, and I've grown very tired.
And in the midst of these questions, rumors, criticisms, scrutiny, he would run for his second term. His opponent was a light-skinned biracial man by the name of Freeman Hendricks. And Hendricks was, again, a callback to respectable black politicians. He was a mild-mannered former deputy mayor, and he was not nearly as boisterous as Kilpatrick. Honestly, he was kind of a doof. Just like I get upset about Kwame Kilpatrick utilizing the very real phenomenon that is racism to obfuscate from how he's a mayor, he would also use the very real phenomenon of colorism to criticize people who wanted to go with a quote-unquote whiter mayor just because Kwame was dark-skinned. And again, the same way I get mad because yes, people do be racist. Yes, people do be colorist. That doesn't change the fact that you're a piece of shit. All things remaining equal, yes, a lighter-skinned black man would be more societally presentable as a leader than a dark-skinned black man, because that's how colorism works, because that's how racism works. Yes. But also, I feel my ears getting hot. But also that does not change the fact that you did all that shit in just your first term in office. And you're trying to say that the reason why people have problems with you is because you dark skinned. Imagine being like, people don't want me to be mayor because I'm dark skinned, and people think you murdered somebody. And even if you had nothing to do with the Tamara Greene thing, there was a lot of shit that you was doing that was just not cool. Stealing from citizens, but I digress. And firing the person that was investigating whether or not you were corrupt. But okay. But again, he had this very preacher way about him. So the more criticism he got, the more he could galvanize his sycophants. And his final push, was to enlist the help of political advisor and all-around asshole by the name of Adolph Mongo, who worked with Coleman Young and other people in the area to basically create advertisements to defend Kwame from the criticisms that he was getting from particularly news outlets. He had a very strong ire against the people who were investigating and looking into him. Mongo is an asshole. And I think he knows that. I'm pretty sure he knows that.
So can you start just by telling us your name and what you do?
Adolph Mongo.
And what do you do?
Fuck with people. That's what I do.
And perhaps his most... I'm getting so mad I could scream. Perhaps his most controversial contribution to this was to create a pamphlet to inform the community that Kwame Kilpatrick was being lynched. Lynching is still legal in America. We are under siege. The mainstream news media have declared war on the city of Detroit. Hanging black men from trees is no longer popular, but a new form of lynching is taking place by way of the news media. They have repeatedly condemned those self-assured African Americans who dare stand up against racism and bigotry in Michigan. The most recent victim of media lynching in Detroit is our mayor, KWAME Kilpatrick. It is one thing to disagree with the way the mayor runs the city, but to sadistically attack him and his family on a very personal level is incomprehensible. In the past year, the news media has called Mayor Kilpatrick a thug, ridiculed Mayor Kilpatrick's appearance, compared Mayor Kilpatrick to the murderous dictators Fidel Castro and Hitler, disrespected the office of mayor by regularly calling Mr. Kilpatrick simply by his first name, Kwame. Look at recent acts of racism in Detroit, cross burnings in the yards of black families in several downriver cities, State of the City speech where Warren's mayor falsely claimed Detroiters were the cause of all the crime in his city, racial profiling of black teenagers riding bikes in East Point, Henry Ford Hospital settlement of $2.1 million to black applicants seeking employment, the outrage by white Livonia residents who don't want a Walmart in their city because it will attract black shoppers from Detroit. A black teen mother from Detroit who killed her newborn goes to jail while white teen mothers who kill their newborns get probation. Why is the media lynching KWAME Kilpatrick? He wouldn't sell away the city's jewels. What? Once you give it away, you can't get it back. Just say no to the suburban raiders and their puppet Helmet Hendricks, aka Freeman, paid for by the citizens of honest government. As you can see, oh so subtly, the pamphlet implies that with the help of the biracial Hendricks, KWAME was the victim of a media lynching and compared his time as mayor to other completely unrelated acts of racism. I guess you can't say it's completely unrelated, but in the sense that he's a black man, it's related to racism. But as far as like him being a bad mayor and whether or not somebody was profiled in East Point, those two things have nothing to do with each other, but he makes them the same and makes that a communal struggle that we all have to protect notably our mayor, KWAME Kilpatrick. They are out to get him. They are out to literally using the word lynch. And if we allow half-white biracial Freeman Hendricks, we are giving away our city to the racist whites with the help of light bread over here. I will give KWAME this. Apparently this was not his idea to do this pamphlet. I will give him that. He enlisted Mongo's help, but he did not ask for the lynching pamphlet.
KWAME was calling me saying, say that wasn't your ad, please. You know.
He was scared.
Yeah, he was scared. I was having a great time. I was in my element.
But it does, again, harken back to this issue that I keep finding when studying him, is that he's staunchly aware, like, sure, he didn't put out a pamphlet about lynching and how he's the victim of lynching, but in his own speeches, he would talk about how he is treated this way because he is a black man. To me, it just harkens back to the sort of this rhetoric around like when P. Diddy got arrested, like, well, white people do sex trafficking all the time. Them needs to go to jail too. All of them needs to go to jail, under the jail. What the instead of making it like, why can't black people do sex crimes too? Maybe we should say, maybe everybody should stop doing sex crimes. Anyway. But this is very much so that type beat. We're leading into the next mayoral debate. The lynching pamphlet, the Tamara Greene story, and the Gary Brown firing are all kind of looming things existing around the concept of the next mayoral race, right? And a lot of things kind of landed on, a lot of people weren't super aware of some of the more nuanced parts of his criticisms, honestly. So a lot of people kind of depended on the way that he presents, literally going off of vibes alone. So when there was a televised debate between Mayor KWAME Kilpatrick versus Freeman Hendricks, it became pretty obvious how if KWAME can do nothing, he can talk.
He posed the question about a pandemic hitting the city of Detroit. Are we ready? You know, what does that look like in terms of preparedness? And Freeman's answer was like, oh, we'll have all of our health clinics together. We'll make sure we have a staff with doctors and nurses. And the professor, said, Mr. Mayor, and gave him the answer. And KWAME's response was, Now, see, this is what I'm talking about.
Was about a pandemic on health, flu. And my opponent talked about he gonna get some clinics up. He's gonna continue to say he's older than me, so he knows more. And Venus and Serena Williams are younger than me, but I can't beat them in tennis. We have to also have an evacuation plan. We have to have a quarantine plan. We also have to move very aggressively to make sure that our least of these, our children and our seniors, are provided with water, are provided with medicine. We also have to know what kind of vaccine stock we have now. None of this was happening when Mr. Hendricks was in office, and he can't speak to it because he doesn't know about it.
And in the midst of all of that charged racial conversation, Rosa Parks would pass away. And for those of you that weren't aware, Rosa Parks moved to Detroit and lived here for many years prior to her death. Kwame Kilpatrick would go, so would Freeman Hendricks. Again, Kwame Kilpatrick is very good at reading the room. He would go up there and pay his respects to the civil rights leader. He would give a speech calling her Mother Parks. That familiarity, that familial touch. Like, that was my grandmother. That was our grandmother. Our collective grandmother did a brave and courageous thing that has brightened all of our futures so that I can be an oppressive piece of shit to you guys right now. She did it for us.
Make no mistake, the Rosa Parks funeral not only suspended campaigning for several inexpensive days, but it also allowed the mayor to look awfully mayoral, standing among the likes of Bill Clinton and Jesse Jackson. The theme of the day was to honor Rosa Parks. Get out there and vote.
Like, I hate him so much to bastardize what the that was, because he is the continuation of Rosa Parks' dream.
7 and 8 and 9 years old because you sat down on that bus, a little chubby kid on the west side of the city of Detroit believed he could be anything he wanted to be.
And before you know it, we're getting closer to the race and they are 4 points away from each other. And I'll be sideways that wins a second term. In fairness, by the way, I don't want to make this sound like Freeman Hendricks would have been a better mayor. I don't know shit about him. I really don't. He seemed very much so in line with this kind of black respectability that I also despise. If anything, learning more about Kwame Kilpatrick just cement why I say politicians, like overall, regardless of party affiliation. I have felt this way for a while because you just get disillusioned. But one thing we do know is that Kwame Kilpatrick was a shit mayor both times. So now, having won his second term, he's going in confident, which is confusing, right? Because he said he didn't want to be mayor the first time. And he was also questioning whether or not he wanted to be mayor the second time, but he ran anyway. Sometimes listen to your instincts. Anyway, part 4. Brown versus Mayor of Detroit. But after years of criticism and scrutiny, it would seem that that pesky Gary Brown was not going away. And so eventually, Gary Brown would sue Kwame and the city of Detroit for wrongful termination and would say that he was fired as retaliation for looking into and investigating the claims around the Manoogian mansion and perhaps in relation to Tamara Greene. Gary Brown was trying to reach a settlement with Kwame and the city of Detroit, but they just said, F you, we're not going to do it. And so they went to trial. In a whistleblower trial, notably and importantly, during this whistleblower trial, Kwame and his press secretary at the time, Christine Beatty, they would testify on their behalf for this whistleblower trial. So this is the whistleblower trial, but also during this time, as we'll find out later, the feds were starting to do a probe looking into the administration as a whole around this time. In the whistleblower trial, as part of it, Kwame and his chief of staff, Christine Beatty, would have to take the stand and would be asked whatever possible reasons they could have to retaliate against Gary Brown, because they swear up and down they didn't retaliate against him. He was fired because he wasn't doing a good job. Also, they would sometimes say he wasn't fired, he was demoted, and so he went to a different place. But like, why are you demoting him? Also, that's still retaliatory? Is that a word? That's still retaliation. And so, in the midst of them being on the stand, they would ask Press Secretary Christine Beatty about various things, one of which was whether or not she had ever had an affair with Mayor Kwame Kilpatrick, and she would outright deny it on the stand. Rolling her eyes is so iconic. She's like, no. Kwame would also be asked the same question, whether or not he had had an affair with his press secretary, Christine Beatty. He would also deny it. But again, because he can't help himself. He can't just say no. He has to go into this long diatribe when he gets up there. His lawyer in cross-examination is like, did you have an affair? He's like, no. And she's like, do you think men and women can work together? You know, this very like sexist, can they work together without f***ing? And this gives him the opportunity to go on his high horse.
My mother is a congresswoman. There have always been strong women around me. My aunt is a state legislator. I think it's absurd to assert every woman that works with a man as a whole. I think it's disrespectful, not just to Christine Beatty, but to women who do a professional job that they do every single day. And it's also disrespectful to their families as well.
But he does this whole speech, just this waxing, sanctimonious sack of shit. Again, this is where he would also assert that was not fired. He was simply removed from his position and demoted, but that he was able to continue working as lieutenant if he wanted to, but he decided to retire. Now, for those of you that have no clue how the law works, particularly testifying on the stand, you are under oath, right? AKA, you can't lie on the stand. Otherwise, you go to jail. Perjury. But that would only be an issue if they were lying. Only they were definitely lying. Pissed me off so much I gotta serve. The affair. Brown would win his civil case against the mayor as well as the city of Detroit and would be awarded $3 million, which Kilpatrick vehemently condemned, saying that he would appeal the decision, that the city didn't have the money to pay that, and that they shouldn't pay that because it was a bad call. At this point, the trial had already cost the city of Detroit, again, that has no money, $9 million, plus whatever, I guess, restitution Gary Brown would get. And KWAME Kilpatrick said that I will appeal this. They will not get away with lying on me. However, not only did he not appeal for very long, if at all, he settled within a very short amount of time, and for more money than Gary Brown was originally awarded. Why, you ask? Well, Brown's lawyer had subpoenaed the telecom company that KWAME Kilpatrick used for his mayoral staff, particularly their text messages, and would find that, when him and Christine were saying they had no sexual relationship at all, that they were simply coworkers and friends, but coworkers, in that they don't communicate on any personal level on state-issued devices. Well, funny story about how they found 14,000 text messages of a sexual or personal nature between him and Christine Beatty that happened in like a year and a half span.
Did you miss me sexually? Kilpatrick, hell yeah. You couldn't tell? I want some more.
So if you're counting at home, if this were to become public, KWAME and Christine Beatty would be in some trouble because they lied under oath about not being in an affair. Brown's lawyer said, hey, do you want to settle this? We can settle it. And they did it very, very quickly. I can imagine why. But somehow, who knows who, we still don't know, the information gets out anyway. And as you can imagine, it's a big deal that sitting Detroit mayor had perjured himself in a court of law and maybe going to jail. So now it's come out that he had been having an affair on his wife, and in a way that was, I can still feel the embarrassment. It hurts. He sits there in a suit that your taxpayer dollars paid for. I'm sorry, Detroit. I'm sorry for cheating on my wife, and I've embarrassed my wife. And then it pans out and you see her sitting next to him. It's very Derek Jackson energy. I'm crying. This is so ghetto.
I want to start tonight by saying to the citizens of this great city, I'm sorry for the embarrassment and the disappointment the events of the past few days have caused you.
Yes, I am angry, I am hurt, and I am disappointed, but there is no question that I love my husband.
He humbly asks for forgiveness.
I humbly ask.
This is a thing that he does a lot. He humbly asks.
I humbly ask
for you to believe that I'm not lying to you. I humbly ask.
I humbly ask.
He loves saying that shit.
I humbly ask.
He loves saying it to the courts. He loves saying it to his wife. He loves saying it to the TV, to his constituents. He just loves saying, I humbly ask.
I humbly ask.
Yes, he does this apology, prays for forgiveness, But he doesn't acknowledge the perjury because I think it was a little early in the case for that. They were about to indict him. He simply says that he will not quit on you. He will not quit on Detroit because I love you, Detroit. We're going back to work tomorrow.
I love you, and I'll see you at work tomorrow.
Now, again, in the aforementioned podcast, Grime Town, they have a very interesting episode devoted strictly to like the emotions of the affair, which was news to me. That's new ground. We're not going to know all that. We were just like, oh, the mayor had an affair. He lied under oath. He might be going to jail. That's crazy. If you want to know more about the intimate, complicated relationship between Kwame and Christine Beatty, feel free to do that. I don't really care to talk about that because I don't think it matters. I think, though, I guess one of the components of their relationship is that the affair would start officially on the night that he won the election the first time. In celebration, they made out and started their romantic affair. They were friends growing up. They went to the same high school. They had dated briefly. They would break up in high school right before they went off to college, and she would marry somebody else. And the affair was the first person outside of her husband that Christine Beatty had ever had sex with. And so, she talks about her whole emotional thing about that. But anyway, they would have this affair for over a year. They would get more and more sloppy trying to hide it. At some point, not even really trying to hide it. His bodyguards and staff people were starting to say, huh? Even his wife started to question, like, what's going on there? And though this affair was his most consequential, certainly, I think it's important to note that it was only one of many.
I was a horrible husband in that area.
What do you mean? I think I have an idea, but what do you mean?
I had other affairs. This was not the only affair that I had.
When the did you have the time to run the city? He would always talk about in the podcast how he spent so much time working. And I was like, maybe you wouldn't have to work so much if you actually did your job while you were there. How embarrassing. Anyway, he would eventually address the city. I remember this so vividly. Oh, it pisses me off to this day because his speech is so etched in my mind because I could not believe that this was gonna do this again. And here I am, egg on my face. Did it again. So he gets up there, he talks about the things that have been going well in the city, trying to make it sound like he's good at his job. And at the very end, he goes off to address the controversies, but not really, not directly. Instead, he addresses people's response to the controversies, would address that his family is being victimized and being harassed by a quote lynch mob mentality, tried and true thing that he always does, which is pull at that very raw and real racial wound in Detroit to deflect, to elicit sympathy. He talks about how he's been called a with a hard R.
I've been called a more than any time in my entire life. Unethical, illegal, lynch mob mentality has to stop.
And you hear like the gasp because again, that evokes emotion. And the fact that he would play on that in the midst of you being caught for being a lying mother as usual, because we'll find out he's done much more than this. But as usual, he elicits that because he knows it creates like a hard stop. Everybody's like, oh my God, touches on the very real trauma that people had in the city so that we wouldn't look at you sideways because you're worthy of being looked at sideways. I hate that. I really do. All of this distraction and posturing. And it reminds me, like to go back to Eric Adams, right after he was indicted for similar things, as you'll find out later when we start to talk about the actual corruptions part.
And we're going to stand by him. Yes, we are. We came this morning to pray for him because prayer changed things. Yes. Let him have his day in court and then we can make our decisions. Amen. But we are not here to criticize the federal government where you might be, but shush.
They love to pull out whatever black person they can find and put the fist up to be like, don't let them attack your brother when they've been you sideways for years. Eric Adams, Kwame Kilpatrick. But for all of his distractions or attempts at distractions and posturing, one thing was just undeniably true. Kwame Kilpatrick had perjured himself. Perjury is a crime.
A 12-count criminal information that contains charges against Mayor Kwame Kilpatrick and Christine Beatty. Conspiracy to obstruct justice, a 5-year felony.
P is for perjury. and prison. Kwame Kilpatrick and Christine Beatty would be charged with conspiracy to obstruct justice, a felony punishable by up to 5 years. They would both plead guilty because, of course, y'all were caught in 4K. The you look like saying, I mean, no, I didn't. As punishment, Kwame would serve 120 days in prison, pay the city of Detroit $1 million in restitution, resign from office, and serve 5 years probation.
I have made the difficult decision, I believe the most difficult decision of my life, to step down as mayor of the city of Detroit.
But even on the way out, he just couldn't help himself. He couldn't do it.
On the way out, he made this infamous promise.
And I want to tell you, Detroit, that you done set me up for a comeback.
Part 7. Justice for Tamara Greene. While in jail, the family of Tamara Greene would sue Kwame Kilpatrick and the city of Detroit for obstructing the investigation into her murder. They would claim that the administration purposely and meticulously destroyed evidence involving Tamara's death and the alleged assault she suffered at the rumored, fabled Manoogian Mansion party. It's going to keep coming up, baby. It all ties together. The ghost of that damn party will not leave, and it's for a reason. Somehow, computers, emails, hard drives, whatever drives had all been destroyed.
Everything is inexplicably gone, including even the computers themselves have been thrown away.
Yatsuma suspects the computer and the records were destroyed deliberately. He wants the judge to order sanctions against the city of Detroit.
So any physical, tangible evidence of any conversations even about Tamara Greene were wiped clean and they didn't have it. I don't know why they didn't do that about the 14,000 text messages about you saying you want to suck a dick, but okay. So instead, the lawyer had to rely on witnesses. There would be a paramedic that would say that he had answered a call about a woman who was injured named Tammy Greene, who was dancing at the Manoogian and was assaulted by the mayor's wife. And she was assisted by 2 plainclothes officers and was taken to the hospital. Her pastor would say that leading up to her murder, she was very nervous and scared, but wouldn't say what had been frightening her. He would actually run her funeral service.
I was standing comforting at the front of the casket with her mother being in a wheelchair, Brenda. She said, Pastor Hampton, that's one of the guys that just beat Tammy up. I said, shh, quiet. I have 2 cameras running. We're taping everything. And then I looked at him and I looked at the gentleman with him. It was obviously a bodyguard. I thought to myself, now who comes to a funeral with a bodyguard except someone that has something, knows something, or been involved in something with this matter? So I said, just be quiet. We're running tapes and we'll turn those tapes in to the proper sources. And I did. To homicide and to the assistant chief of police, because I just assumed that the police would do their job.
And did anything come of that?
Not that I know of.
Also, I think it's important to note that Gary Brown wasn't the only officer that suffered some repercussions for even asking questions about Kwame Kilpatrick, Tamara Greene, and the Manoogian. A homicide lieutenant named Alvin Bowman would say that her case had caused him pause. He was looking into the shell casings, looking into whether or not they were from police-issued weapons. He would claim that there were missing evidence reports, and these things would make him wonder, or just even ask the question if there was some police involvement. And the moment he asked that question, he was transferred. Just so happens, after 31 years at that precinct. So, we're not saying that he had anything to do with it, but it does seem that everybody that starts asking questions ends up not working there anymore. So when Tamara Greene's family would sue the city, their lawyer would reach the wall and finding out that there's no evidence because it had been explicitly destroyed.
Together with the testimony of 9 different folks on the city of Detroit's payroll, it became clear to us that she was taken to the hospital, admitted under a false name. Everybody was cleared out. The hospital records were destroyed.
Now, in a way that feels oh so Detroitian of the time. There would be a magistrate judge that looks over the case and decides whether or not it's worth going to trial. And he would sanction the city of Detroit for destroying evidence in relation to Tamara Greene. However, before the ink is even dry on that shit, another judge will throw the case out entirely, saying that they don't think they can proceed because there is a lack of evidence. So if you're confused at home, because I am, they admit that the evidence was destroyed, but because the evidence was destroyed, we don't have a case. So I guess we're not going to do anything with it. He did a good job, I guess. And so, though there is no explicit evidence per se or final word about whether or not Kwame Kilpatrick or any of his cronies in the Detroit Police Department had anything to do with the death of Tamara Greene, or whether or not she danced at a fabled Manoogian mansion party and was assaulted by his wife Carlita, there is enough to make you go, huh? Huh? It's just so fucked up because her kids have been trying to get justice for her for what, 20 years? 20 something years? And every time someone even tries to kind of look into it, they get fired or transferred or demoted, or something goes awry. But at least Kwame was in jail, at least for a few days, for lying about having an affair. It seems really silly in the grand scheme of the things that he could have probably gone to jail for at this point. Moving to Texas and parole violation. But after 99 days in jail, Kwame Kilpatrick would be released from his perjury/obstruction of justice charge. Surely Kwame wouldn't squander this new lease on life. You know, all he had to do was pay the restitution, which would just be a fraction of the money that he undoubtedly shat away in a very economically burdened city in the thick of the 2008 financial crisis, no less, and just live out a new life in Texas after seeking counsel, of course, from prolific power bottom TD Jakes.
Texas is a place where a lot of people come for a new start, and so do we.
So he moves to Texas. But this is Kwame we're talking about, and he just can't help himself. He pled guilty to the perjury charges, because what else are you supposed to do, right? He agreed to pay $1 million to the city. He told the city he was too impoverished to do anything close to repairing some of the financial damage that he had put the city through, if through nothing but his trials that he had lost $9 million in the court case by itself, plus the like $5 million the city had to pay Gary Brown. He just had to actually be poor. Lo and behold, some Detroit journalists would find that he was currently living in a Texas mansion that was worth about $1 million. It was found that he had been paid large sums of money by Detroit, like prolific businessmen and all that shit, to step down as mayor. Also, he was working a tech job. He had a 6-figure salary. He would say that he didn't know who was paying for the house, whether or not his wife was employed. He's like, I don't know. The mansion just happened, and I don't know. I'm broke. I just live in a mansion, and I don't know who's paying for it. But I'm telling you, I'm too broke to pay the city of Detroit because I'm too busy paying for a house that was double the price of all the houses around it, too, by the way. He couldn't just get a different house in the same area. He had to get a big-ass mansion that had double the mortgage payments of any other house in the area.
At the time, Kilpatrick was paying nearly twice as much for cable and internet as he was paying in restitution to Detroit. Prosecutor Kim Worthy ripped off this letter to the Corrections Department. She claimed Kilpatrick was, quote, once again hiding assets. After Worthy's protests, the state did raise Kilpatrick's restitution payment from $160 a month to $500, and he's up to date on his payments.
He was told by Detroit courts to pay $300,000 in 90 days, and he missed that first payment of like $79,000. And so they would tell him, bring your ass back up here. And undoubtedly, Kwame, being the raging narcissist that he is, thought he was just going to get a slap on the wrist. And that's where he goes up to him and he gives this whole sob story that after he left Detroit, all he wanted to do was repair his family.
When I walked out of that jail cell February 4th, 2009, only thing on my mind was to reconcile with my family.
So he spent money on his wife, trying to buy back her love. And
in my stupidity, and now I know that it is stupidity, I tried to buy my way back in, overabundance of presents, and trying to make everything perfect.
Yada yada, and I humbly ask, Judge.
I respectfully, humbly ask,
Lord, please forgive me
for everything that's in me to be free. I want to go home, y'all, where I belong.
And the judge is like, Mr. Kilpatrick, you lied to the court about whether or not you can pay restitutions. For the last time, you lied to the court. What is wrong? No, you can't just humbly ask. You going to jail.
Most compelling is that you lied to this court. Continued to lie after pleading guilty to lying in court. Obviously, there has been no rehabilitation because you have violated probation. You lied in the affidavit. Your documents were not fully disclosed. You lied in this courtroom. This court is satisfied that incarceration must now correlate
for a minimum of 1.5 to 5 years. And then after which he would still have to pay the $800,000 that he had not paid yet by the time he ended up in jail in, like, I want to say 2010 or something like that. A lot has been thrown at you, but I need to remind you that ever since his first term, there had been an ongoing federal investigation into KWAME Kilpatrick, particularly of suspicions of corruption, perhaps RICO. The investigation would be called Operation Bombay Dreams, based on a random Andrew Lloyd Webber musical that had nothing to do with the case at all. And essentially, the feds would investigate the paper trail of his finances, particularly where like these mysterious round numbers of cash would be deposited into his account. 2,000 here, 3,000 here, 1,000, and that's strange, especially if you don't know where it's coming from. Of course, as mayor, he had a salary that was paid by the city, and it was, a particular amount. But what they noticed is that outside of the legitimate ways in which he acquired income, he had about, give or take, $800,000 of unaccounted for money. One day, investigators would get a tip that bribes were being paid at Cobo Hall. Cobo Hall was a convention center in downtown. They've renamed it to something else, and that broke my heart because my childhood is it being called Cobo Hall. Anyway, he was saying that there were bribes being handed off at Cobo Hall. And the man who was contracted to do electrical and janitorial work for the center would be said to be giving paper bags of money to local officials in order to lower the commission that he paid the city. This man was a man named Carl Cato, if I remember correctly, and the feds would end up flipping him and giving him a wire to figure out which public officials he was talking to and which ones were taking bribes. And apparently one of the people that were taking bribes was Bernard Kilpatrick, KWAME Kilpatrick's father. So after KWAME had become mayor, Bernard Kilpatrick had stepped down from his whatever political thing he was doing, and he became a consultant. It was found that Bernard was taking bribes from particularly companies that wanted to work in water and sludge in the city and were looking for city contracts to do so. But before that could be approved, before they could be hired to do that contract work for the city, it would have to be approved by the mayor and the city council. A bunch of companies were vying for that contract because it's very lucrative for them. They would start trying to pay bribes to Bernard to try to get a good word in with the mayor. Eventually, this kind of seemingly became just the way things worked around here, because eventually Bernard seemed to expect like a kickback from any company that was trying to work in any major way with the city of Detroit, because his son was the mayor. Eventually, with enough information, the feds started bugging Bernard Kilpatrick. And they would find that in some situations, he was charging like a 50% markup on these giant millions and millions of dollars contracts for him and his girlfriend. And so the feds go up to the vice president of the water and sludge company and try to flip him too. And basically he was like, yeah, I was kind of over this shit anyway. It felt like every time I tried to do random business, I was always getting shaken down for a bribe. Take him down. I don't give a And please rest assured, Bernard wasn't just your normal shake him down crook. Oh no, he was petty. He was petty and greedy. He would demand the $20 in your pocket because Christmas is coming up and I got some presents to buy. He would even accept bribes in form of whatever you had in your pocket hidden in a gum wrapper. He was,
There's one instance where you're seen taking money in a gum wrapper.
I remember that, but I'm saying there wasn't no money in there.
$300.
Oh, okay. Well, I don't mean to demean $300.
So now working with the feds, the VP of the water and sludge company was told to stop paying his bribes and see how Bernard would react, to kind of like really put the nail in a coffin. And so he didn't seem too happy about it, would even call the company, threatening to withhold water and sludge company building permits. And being that Bernard is a citizen, what leverage do you have to say that the company can't get building permits if you weren't leveraging or didn't have the ability to leverage the mayor to make those decisions? He'd also call him saying, I want my money, which is pretty clear cut. They devise a plan to have him try to give him money in public, try to give Bernard money in public. About $2,500 in cash at like a pancake house. And Bernard was very pissed off about it. And several months later, when they would see each other again, he would say, "You do dumb shit like try to give me money in a restaurant in public. I don't want people to see me taking money. Don't give me money in public so people know we criming. We trying to crime. What is wrong with you?"
I'm talking, you talking that, then you take that little 2500 and have it in a restaurant.
I'm sorry, BK, but listen to me.
The way you do shit like that.
Okay.
I don't ever want anybody to see me take some money.
Okay.
I don't ever want anybody to see me take some money from somebody.
Eventually, word would get back to Kwame that there was a federal investigation going on. And Kwame would try to warn his father to be a bit weary of the water and sludge vice president, or as he liked to call him, quote, the little white guy. And because there's a bug on Bernard's phone, Kwame doesn't want to say like, "Hey, stop taking bribes from the little white guy." He's like, "Hey, be a little careful of that dude, the little, that your dude, your friend there." But Bernard doesn't know who the fuck he's talking about. And that was funny as because he's like, "Who? This person? This other person I'm taking bribes from? This person?" I say all that to say, this would give an example of how Kwame was not ignorant to the fact that there was something going on with his father in regards to contracts. And he was in some way involved in this triangle of bribery. And eventually there would be enough evidence that Kwame, Bernard, and Kwame's friend, a man named Bobby Ferguson, would be taken in on RICO charges. They would be charged with bribery, wire fraud, extortion, and bid rigging in federal court. Now, he had accepted that he perjured himself, but this time he said, "I ain't do it this time. I may have did it before. I didn't do it this time." But they would show in the trial that Kwame's definitely the type like that. First, they showed evidence that he had been stealing from his own charity, a charity that was set up to do neighborhood improvement work around Detroit.
In his second term as mayor, Kwame Kilpatrick spent more than $8,600 here at the five-star La Costa Resort, but the money wasn't his. It was supposed to help some of you. It came from his nonprofit, tax-exempt Kilpatrick Civic Fund, founded to help improve Detroit.
Great time to do this because, again, really hard times on Detroit. My eyes are watering from anger and sadness and frustration. He was taking money that was meant for them, and he stole about $500,000 out of that charity foundation and used it to pay for yoga, spa visits, vacations.
Government lawyers said it paid almost $36,000 for Kilpatrick political research in 2001, a claim that directly contradicted what Kilpatrick himself said in a debate on Channel 7.
We haven't used one penny of the Civic Fund in this campaign because it's not allowed by law.
And that was just like minor fraud, because the big daddy fraud was, again, the kickbacks that were coming from water and sewage contractors, big and small. I also want to note that it created a culture, it probably already existed, if anything, exacerbated a culture of businesses having to participate in bribery to get any work done in the city. That was the culture that was taking place. If you weren't in the bed with Kwame, Bernard, or Kwame's friend Bobby Ferguson, you were not getting any business. Basically, they would extort and bully contractors, in the process getting kickbacks in order for them to do any work in the city. There were text messages, again, that would show Kwame and Bobby laughing at someone who was looking to work for them without paying bribes, essentially. They were like, "Okay, that's not how that works here, bitch." Again, in the middle of just like the city falling apart, they were extorting contractors, big and small, businesses, big and small, basically saying that you will not work here if you do not pay a sizable amount of bribes to Bernard, Kwame Kilpatrick, Bobby Ferguson. And eventually they would follow that mysterious money that was unaccounted for in Kwame Kilpatrick's possession, and would find that money was often coming from the friend Bobby Ferguson. Pretty clear. There was evidence that he was aware of it, that he was participating in it, that he was racking in some money as a result of it. And so he was found guilty. He got 28 years for RICO charges for corruption and racketeering. And so he was going to go away for a long time. Bobby Ferguson would get 20 years and Bernard would get 15 months in jail, because the jury was kind of deadlocked on to what degree he knew certain things and what his charges were. He wasn't a public official at that point, so it was kind of murky. But there was some evidence that other shit was happening. Like, they knew that was doing it, but they didn't have the hard evidence of it. Clemency and right-wing grifting. So off to jail he goes. This should be the end of the story, but it's not. It would be if only 2020 didn't happen. Because after 8 years in federal prison, Kwame Kilpatrick was granted clemency on the final day of Donald Trump's first presidency.
The Trump administration states, quote, "This commutation is strongly supported by prominent members of the Detroit community, Alveda King, Alice Johnson, Diamond and Silk, Pastor Paulo White, Peter Carmanos, State Representatives Sherry Gay Danyogo, Karen Whitsett, as well as more than 30 faith leaders."
Kilpatrick's co-defendant, Bobby Ferguson, was not on that list.
And he was let out in 2021. He would remarry. Oh my God! When will this learn? Become an ordained minister.
Former Detroit Mayor Kwame Kilpatrick is back in the spotlight, preaching to a packed house in Detroit.
You know how I can be who I am now? Because the light came on. The light came on.
A lot of these people end up becoming ministers because it is ultimately, much like politics, all a gathering of cult personality. So that does not surprise me that he is able to talk a good game for people that want to hear that shit. Again, these are people who are primed to accept and forgive and romanticize the redemption of a person. They love a redemption arc. Being that he was let out of prison by Trump, he is now a boot-licking Trump fanboy. Because what else is he gonna be? Like, what is he gonna say? He let me out of jail. That nigga though, I still hate him. Definitely isn't doing that. He's on the way other direction. He's a boot-licking fanboy, sycophant, as much as I would have expected.
I want to meet him. I want to shake his hand. I want to talk to him. I've sent a letter. I've tried to, because I think it's deserving. I'm not as emotional about politics as people in the streets.
So why were you the mayor? I swear to God, whenever I see this, whenever I hear him talk, I just want to, whoa! Because the that isn't as emotional about politics, aka isn't as invested in politics, became the mayor and drained the already struggling city and just left it in shambles. His crimes and his terrible just investments and he just did a lot of dumb shit in general. Even the not illegal shit he did, just his time as mayor, he just made terrible investments, and he is a hefty component of why Detroit went bankrupt in 2013. Some terrible investments he did with the crash in 2008 just really Detroit bad. And in the midst of that, they were spending money on his dumbass trials because he kept lying. I'm so tired of apathetic ass people becoming powerful, because that's what they want. They just want the power of it. They want the prestige of it, but they don't respect what that means and how that affects people, because they don't care. Never have. It was never about if you're not going to get emotional about the people you serve, then stay the home. God damn it. And with that said, even after leaving the prison sentence, he still says that though he lied under oath that one time, he didn't lie about the RICO thing, and he's out of, he didn't do the RICO thing. Last I've heard, he was preaching at a Republican Party dinner in Novi, Michigan.
My house was on fire. My wife and all my children were in it. Firefighter kicked in the front door. He dragged me at 300 pounds out the door. He grabbed my wife, grabbed her out, and got all my kids out, got us on the front lawn, and the firefighter pulled up his mask, and it was Donald Trump.
It's one thing to be like, thank you for letting me out of jail. I can't blame a man for saying, thank you for letting me out of jail. I would have been in there for 20 more years. Thanks, right? But it would seem that one of the stipulations of sorts, I don't even think it's a stipulation. He looks so happy to do it. Is to go up there and just Donald Trump in front of an audience.
I want Trump in the room when Vladimir Putin shows up.
Yeah, he seems completely comfortable with his right-wing grift or shift, like whichever you want to call it. This is very in line with Kwame Kilpatrick. He has always been and always will be politically, financially, emotionally, psychologically, whatever otherly devoted to himself. And whatever he has to do to squirrel and slink away, that's what he's going to do. But that doesn't make it any less annoying to watch. He is still the same self-involved, bombastic, selfish piece of shit that he's always been. As usual, he has no conviction, no loyalty, no faith other than that of his own self-interest, much in the same way that he would utilize the wounds and frustrations and depressions around race and color and the plight of disenfranchised Black communities. It does not surprise me that in just one of many ways, he will toss y'all to the side like he's always done. And now he's bootlicking for Trump. And I'm sure he'll be a very useful for Trump whenever he needs to pull one of y'all out to do a dance. Look at my Black guy. Yeah, he'll be that Black guy. Also utilizing the church. Anyway, I'll talk about this forever because I really could. Conclusion. It's been over 20 years since Kwame Kilpatrick first got in office, and he is still a stick in my craw and a pain in my ass. He made me a political cynic from a very young age, before I could even fully comprehend what that even means. I was 12 years old watching neighborhood schools close down. I was having to learn in classes that had like 35 plus people in that bitch because there was no money for other schools. Houses upon houses boarded up and abandoned, all while this laughed and smirked and lied to those people that believed in him and put so much hope in him as he exploited their aspirations for him and pandered to their face and robbed them blind. And he's still out there. He still ain't paid that $800,000. He say he don't owe it. He might not. I don't know what clemency involves. And I'm so tired of talking about I want it to be done. So I didn't look it up. And if that is the case, that he doesn't owe $800,000 to the city, that's just another $800,000 that he shat away at the expense of the people that he says he loves. He loves Detroit. He love you, Detroit. And so now that we're at the bottom of this video, the end of this video, when I say I hate this, it's personal. I feel it with my whole chest. Again, I'm not surprised by his shift over to pastor, minister, whatever. It falls in line with his desire to just talk a lot. He will be welcomed in as a prize token to evangelicals, particularly white evangelicals. And though it doesn't surprise me, it does disgust me enough to make a very remarkably long video about it. So there you go. That's the video. Lean into your communities. Lean into the people around you. Call out bullshit when you see it. That's how the he got this far. Yeah, that's all. If you like today's video, feel free to like today's video. Follow me on all my social media, Instagram and Bluesky, both of which are KennieJD. I realize I've been putting this on, but I didn't say what it is. It is the Fenty Gloss Bomb in Fuchsia Flex. Anyway, that's all for today, folks. Bye.